I want to welcome everybody to this final panel of the day, which is entitled, this final panel of the day, which is entitled The Future of Peace and War, Planet Earth 2050. My name is Laura Henghold, and I'm Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Philosophy at Case, and I have been unbelievably honored to have the opportunity these last couple of days to learn from such distinguished guests and also to learn from such illuminating conversations that people have been having up here on the podium. I also want to thank very much Shannon French, the Inamori Center, and the Peace Academy for holding this conference at Case. It's been incredibly interesting to me as a political philosopher and also as representative of the Department of Philosophy. There's going to be an opportunity tomorrow to ask further questions of some of the panelists, but this is going to be sort of the last thematic panel, and as a result, we're not going to have the chance to wrap up all of the questions, but we're hoping that this will give a framework for moving forward and for everyone in the audience moving forward in their thought as well as hopefully in action. So I want to introduce to you the members of this afternoon's panel, and I'm going to I guess I will begin closest to me, and I will gradually circle around. The person immediately, the guest immediately to my right is Professor Min Tai, who is a gifted poet and journalist, currently serving as Chair of Communications and Journalism at the University of Humanities and Social Sciences in Hanoi, Vietnam. She received her PhD at the St. Petersburg Academic Institute of Theater, Movie, and Music in 1992, and she is the author of several books and articles on culture and the arts, including the prize-winning essay from 1995, Theater and Me. She's a member of numerous councils promoting excellence in fiction, theater, and literary criticism. Next to Professor Min Tai is Mr. Kai Brand Jacobsen, who is Director of the Department of Peace Operations of the Peace Action Training and Research Institute of Romania, also known as PATRIR. He's also an international expert in mediation, early warning and war prevention, post-war recovery. He's an international advisor on civil peace services and also strategic conflict analysis. These skills enable him to consult for governments, foreign ministries, and international and national organizations, including the Commonwealth Secretariat, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, UN country missions, and the Working Group on Conflict Issues for the British Parliament. In 2009, Kai headed an international research project on peace-building strategies in Palestine and Israel, and he's currently director of a similar project in Iraq. And he tells me that he has just come from the Sudan, where he is working on a peace-building project in order to prevent the outbreak of war if, in fact, the referendum for the south of the Sudan to separate and become independent from the north actually goes through in January, 2 months from now. Next seat over is Dr. Shannon French. Dr. Shannon French, whom you have probably met in the course of these events, is the Inamori Professor of Ethics and Director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence at Case Western Reserve University. She comes to us with 11 years as Associate Professor of Philosophy and Associate Chair of the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law at the United States Naval Academy. Her main area of research is military ethics, especially conduct of war issues. She is associate editor for the Journal of Military Ethics and has written numerous articles and an acclaimed book on the topic entitled Code of the Warrior, Exploring Warrior Values, Past and Present. Very glad that she can be on this panel. Mr. Cheek Dombach has been president and CEO of the Alliance for Peace Building, a network of conflict resolution experts and organizations devoted to reducing the frequency and severity of conflict since 2005. Previously, he was president of Operation Respect, a New York-based organization to combat bullying and school violence, and also served as president and CEO of the National Peace Corps Association from 1992 to 1998. He worked with returned Peace Corps volunteers to help end the border war in Eritrea and Ethiopia, and he has also worked with rebel leaders in the government of the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, to form a coalition government to end the last civil war. or at least to change the pace of events. His memoir, Exhaust the Limits, the Life and Times of a Global Peace Builder, will appear in print this month. Next, we have Dr. Dot Maver. Dr. Dot Maver is president of the National Peace Academy and serves on the Leadership Council of the Global Alliance for Ministries and Departments of Peace. She formerly served as executive director of the Peace Alliance and a campaign for a U.S. Department of Peace. And she was the national campaign manager for the Dennis Kucinich presidential campaign in 2004. She has written a book on conscious education for peace and freedom and facilitates workshops on that topic. And she has also written a book on her innovative hitting technique in the world of fast-pitch softball. And maybe she will be able to say something about whether or not sports actually have a role to play in building international cooperation. Some people have speculated about these things. Our last guest, extremely distinguished, comes to us with a career in the Japanese Air Staff as well as the study of military history, and that's retired Major General Yoshinaga Hayashi. He is a graduate of the National Defense Academy of Japan and the U.S. Air University. He then became head of general affairs for the Air Staff Office and commander of the Northern ACNW. From 1999 to 2001, General Hayashi was Director of Military History and professor at the National Institute of Defense Studies, after which he retired from service and became acting director of the Japanese Forum for Strategic Studies. So we have representatives on this panel both from the field and also from the academy, many parts of the world, and I'm really hoping that we will learn a tremendous amount and also have the opportunity to take questions forward for the future. My first question is going to be very general, and I am assuming that no one here has a crystal ball. But given the subtitle of this discussion, Planet Earth 2050, I would really like to hear your thoughts on where humanity will be with respect to peace and war 40 years from now. What's the best case scenario that's still realistic to you? And what is the worst case scenario that you would most fear, given the information we have today? Maybe we'll start with Professor Min Tai. Thanks.
Tôi xin phép được nói bằng tiếng Việt. Tôi cho rằng là cái gọi là sự nhân đạo ấy, thì luôn luôn làm cơ sở văn hóa cho việc giải quyết tất cả những sự kiện đã, đang và sẽ xảy ra trong tương lai. Tôi cho rằng là trên cơ sở đó thì sẽ thấy rằng thế giới có hai khả năng xảy ra. Một là thế giới sẽ vẫn còn chiến tranh, và hai là thế giới sẽ hết chiến tranh. Đấy là hai tình huống mà có thể xảy ra. Nhưng tôi cũng cho rằng là với tất cả các cái sự phát triển của khoa học kỹ thuật của thế giới, thì những sự kiện xảy ra trên thế giới nó sẽ bị phụ thuộc vào việc thay đổi. Bởi vì 40 năm nữa thì khoa học kỹ thuật sẽ phát triển vô cùng là lớn, và tất cả các cái diện mạo của thế giới sẽ khác hẳn. Cả cái tốt lẫn cái xấu, cả sự hủy hoại lẫn sự xây dựng, và cả tình yêu nữa cũng có thể thay đổi. Vì vậy nhân loại cần phải trưởng thành hơn. Trong tất cả sự thay đổi ấy thì nhân loại cần phải trưởng thành hơn. Theo tôi bây giờ nhân loại có một cái lỗi mà chúng tôi cho rằng đấy là một cái lỗi văn hóa. Đó là nhân loại còn rất là thiếu cái sự phát triển một cách trên một trình độ cao. Có nghĩa là hơi bị ngây thơ. Nói theo ngôn ngữ của Việt Nam là hơi bị ngây thơ. Chính vì thế nó xảy ra sự thiếu hiểu biết. Và tôi nghĩ rằng thiếu hiểu biết sẽ khiến nhân loại lúng túng khi giải quyết các vấn đề. Thí dụ, thiếu hiểu biết về sự khác biệt về văn hóa, vì mỗi quốc gia có một nền văn hóa, và cái nền văn hóa này không thể nói là quốc gia này thì văn hóa tốt, còn quốc gia khác thì văn hóa xấu. Vấn đề là ở chỗ nhìn nhận sự khác biệt để tiến tới sự thông cảm và hiểu biết lẫn nhau. Vì vậy, thí dụ tôi cho rằng, thí dụ sự không thể nói là đạo Phật thì tốt và đạo Kitô giáo thì không tốt bằng. Và cũng không thể nói là các bạn ăn bằng nĩa và chúng tôi ăn bằng đũa, thì ăn bằng đũa thì kém hơn ăn bằng nĩa. Và cũng không thể nói là các bạn yêu cái người đàn ông của mình hơn là chúng tôi yêu người đàn ông của chúng tôi. Cho nên tôi thấy rằng cái sự khác biệt ấy cần phải nhờ đến truyền thông. Truyền thông sẽ làm cho chúng ta xích lại gần nhau hơn và chúng ta sẽ hiểu nhau hơn. Còn đấy là tình huống tốt nhất. Và có một tình huống xấu hơn là tình huống là tất cả thế giới sẽ bị hủy diệt vì chiến tranh. Và lúc ấy trình độ phát triển cao cho đến mức là cả kẻ đi hủy diệt chiến tranh lẫn những người mà bị chiến tranh hủy diệt cùng sẽ bị hủy diệt. Vì tôi nghĩ rằng trình độ cao đến cái mức mà người ta không thể chủ động gây ra chiến tranh được, cũng như người ta không thể bị động để nhận chiến tranh một cách ngây thơ như ngày xưa nữa. Không còn ngây thơ nữa, nhân loại không còn ngây thơ nữa. Cho nên thế giới trở nên rất là phẳng như tên một cuốn sách của người Mỹ. Và tôi thích dẫn một cái câu của Shakespeare là sống hay không sống, tồn tại hay không tồn tại là dựa trên sự hiểu biết lẫn nhau về văn hóa. Vì vậy cần phải giải quyết hai tình huống ấy trên cơ sở văn hóa. Thank you. Cảm ơn.
Thank you very much. And now in translation into English will be done.
In 40 years from now on, there are two possibilities for war and peace. I believe that the development of science, of technology, and of culture of human beings, as we know nowadays, will make war and peace in 40 years later a very terrible war, and it will have a totally different face. Both the good things and the bad things, both the construction and the destruction, both love and hatred will be put to the highest level, the highest degree. Therefore, the reason and the passions of human beings should be changed in order to be able to answer to the new challenges of peace and war 40 years later. I think that human beings at this point still lack of understanding of one another, particularly the understanding about culture. There is the difference, and I'd like to focus on this. It is the difference. It's not the problem of right or wrong in culture. You use the fork or the knife when you eat, and we use the chopsticks. Or you eat bread and we eat rice. You practice Catholicism, we practice Buddhism. But it's not this side or the other side is wrong or right. It's just the difference. Or the difference between the East and the West. The difference between the Muslim and the Christianity. Or the difference will put mankind apart if we don't try to understand one another. And I believe that the communication and the media can help human beings to understand each other better. In 40 years later, I do believe that media and communication can help human beings to avoid war and to protect international peace. But in the worst situation, no one in this room who cannot imagine what happened with the world in 40 years ago. It will be a very horrible war. And in that war, there will be no winner or no loser, because everyone will be destroyed. And I believe that the world in the future is a flat world in which there's no winner or there's no loser. It's just like Shakespeare has said, to be or not to be. So I believe in the peace, in the international peace in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mintai, for those sobering and important thoughts. Retired Major General Hayashi, would you be willing to offer the next set of speculations, reasoned speculations about what do you see happening in the next 40 years, best and worst case scenario?
Okay, thank you, Laura. Depending upon any questions, my answer is only one. I'm preparing the papers for 4 or 5 days until today. So I'm talking about that, what I want to say. But initially, you see, we three guys are very happy, surrounded the very charming ladies today. On the other hand, I'm thinking by myself, I'm afraid of something, ladies' power. Anyway, at first, I should say my appreciation to Shannon. I was given the order to be here just 1 week before, but Shannon accepted the urgent visit of mine so kindly. Thank you very much. And in addition to that, I was influenced by the Dr. Padin Rivera concerning on the traumatization, or Dr. Ed Tick. Your exercise is very influential to me. So my presentation is influenced a lot of yours exercise. Thank you. And scheme is the War and Peace in 2050. At that time, I would be more than 100 years old. So I can be the very, how to say, not responsible of my comment. So let me say that in Japan, 60 years peacetime, that make Japan estranged the scheme of this one, war and peace. So in the case of mine, it's very good fortune to discuss about that with you today. You know terminology, RMA, Revolution in Military Affairs. Mm-hmm. In middle of 1980s, British scholar Michael Roberts expressed his papers on the occasion of his Memorial Day of the university concerning on the war between the Gustav Adolf and the Napoleonic War, which means the nation states appeared at that time, at that period. Influenced by the conscription of the Napoleon and the industrial war and railroad and the advanced communication systems changed the war very much. You know, war changed the civilization, and the civilization changed the war repeatedly. In other words, war changed the society, and the society changed the war. So this phenomena is repeated now and future. War changed everything. But it's not the scheme of this panel on revolution in military affairs. In the context of this scheme, I would like to say the changeable phenomena and unchangeable phenomena. Very important point is unchangeable phenomena. Since the classic war until now and then, that is the sacrifice. I mean, sacrifice including casualty, victim, combatant, non-combatant, male, female, kids, adult, including everything, in addition to relatives and wounded, psychologically, physically, and mentally. Intentional or not, this nature has been nothing changed. Maybe this is my perspective. In the future, 2050, sacrifice will never change. The nature of sacrifice, subjectively, that's fear, pride, love, credo, and so on. Objectively, salvation, mercy, and love, and so on. On the other hand, this sacrifice is always recommended, required by the nation, government, or top leaders. For instance, I saw the newspaper Stars and Stripes, which was published in Far East United States military personnel. Right before the Iraq War, this Stars and Stripes mentioned the Iraq War. This is illegal, but legitimate. That is the nature of war. I guess this is very difficult to select whether go or not. But on the other hand, military personnel, drafted or conscripted, all military personnel will be required the military rationalization. He or she should kill enemy. That's one of the nature of war, I think. On the other hand, after dispatching, in the case of Vietnam, in the case of Iraqi, sometimes soldiers were betrayed by the criticism or the even government. At that time, warrior soldiers feel the guilty conscience, maybe. I believe that. They lost the justice. They lost the legitimacy by the criticism or a government comment. So let me say the other example. That is playing softball. That's right?
That's right.
Baseball is United States-made sports. I recognize baseball is the sacrifice sports game, you know. Occasionally, the case of important game, baseball manager ordered the player to go sacrifice bunt.
Sacrifice
you know.
bunt.
Achievement of sacrifice bunt, he is becoming hero. But on the other hand, baseball manager made a mistake tactically. How to do it? He's not a hero. But individually, sacrifice is sacrifice. I mean, what's the cost of sacrifice? That is no change. Has never changed. Now, no change, and will never change, I mean. And excess of explaining is, I quit. I want to say my thinking to the sacrifice. Highest precious experience on sacrifice. We should never be forgotten. We should be never criticized. We should be never waste the sacrifice. We should never throw away the sacrifice. And we should be entrusted, appreciated, honored, and understood. That is the manner of ours to the sacrifice. Sacrifice never changed. Lastly, I want to say, on the occasion of my participation, Soldier's Heart by the Ed last night, I mean, he mentioned, and some veterans mentioned that. Honor the warrior, not the war. And PTSD on individual sacrifice, that is the proof of humanity, you mentioned. I was impressed strongly at that time. On Peace and War, Planet Earth 2050, unless forgetting the precious individual sacrifices, there will be born the peace. I believe that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. If I understand what you're saying, then sacrifice is something that testifies to the human capacity to rise above circumstances and put a moral face on what might otherwise seem to be inhuman. Maybe Dr. Maver will say something about what other ways there are of testifying to it, and how also to make sure that no sacrifice is wasted, especially in this domain where human life is so much at stake.
Yeah.
Yes, actually, as you speak of sacrifice, and I love the alluding to softball, actually, sacrifice bunt, bottom of the seventh. It's like, so for me, to sacrifice means to make sacred. And as you're speaking, I'm mindful of being in Okinawa in 2007. And being with a group of elders who told a wonderful story about a potential tragedy when the island was being overtaken by the Japanese, actually. And the king said to all the people on the island of Okinawa, "Nuchi do takara." Nuchi do takara. And that means life is a treasure. And the people put down anything that could be used as an instrument of violence, and there was no bloodshed as Okinawa was taken over. And I've often thought of that in terms of sacrifice, to really own and recognize or recognize the sacredness of life itself. So as I have been in an inward, not outward, as you've noted all week, contemplative mode, which is my striving to maintain that, that contemplative mode. This question that you've posed, Laura, and thank you for posing it, which puts us in the year 2050, I think is most challenging for us at this moment in time to stand in together. It's such a slippery slope to come back to the very, very challenging moment we live in. We're facing an all systems breakdown, not just in the United States of America, around the world. Climate change alone, which impacts us all, but so many things, and that we've talked about all week. So what is the all systems breakthrough? And just to ask that question and stay in 2010, we're still going to have the tendency to look at what's wrong and see how we're going to fix it. And if life is sacred, and we might all agree with that, and if it would be just atrocious if someone were to die in this room right now by anything other than natural causes, and we would all agree with that, then in 2050, we're not going to be having summits on peace and war, because we will have learned to deal with conflict wisely and responsibly before it ever escalates to violence. We won't be talking about war. War will have been made archaic. It will be something that we will look back on, and our children, or well, not my children, that I'm with you on that, 50 years from now. Well, I'll still be in my 90s. I'll be all right. So I'll still be singing and dancing, right? Playing a little softball here and there. So in 2050, as we look back, it will be the children of that time reading a history book and saying, wow, is it true that people shot each other? Is it true that airplanes went over cities or towns and dropped things that they called bombs that actually killed our brothers and sisters? And so the question then becomes, how do we get there? Because in 2050, if we are living in a time when our institutions and our own temples, the home that I live in, called this body, this personality called Dot, if they're sacred and they have embodied and are reflecting the principles and processes of a world living in right relationship with self, others, and the planet, and I would take it even beyond there, but that's another conversation, with the full respect and honoring and loving understanding that puts into practice those values and ethics and processes. I mean, now I'm living there. So the question for me then becomes, how do we get there? And when the second part of your question, what's the greatest fear? I have to say, I don't live there. I just don't live there. I would say, what's the greatest love we can know? And that's where I'm coming from right now. There's already a fire raging, and that fire is violence in today's world. It is just raging, and it's like trying to quit cigarettes. You know, I hate cigarettes. The cigarettes make my clothes smell terrible. They stink up the car, whatever. I can't take a deep breath. Every time I say the word cigarette, even though I want to quit, I am throwing a log on this fire that's raging that has to do with cigarettes. So, if there's a fire, how do I quit cigarettes? I would like to be healthy. I would like to be able to take a deep breath, et cetera, et cetera. So if there's a fire raging on this planet right now called violence, give me some kindling. What is it that we need to be thinking about and talking about and creating our institutions, from education to political to health to military to government to everything, based on. And that's the conversation. So my final comment is I'm going to use just 30 seconds to invite all of us into the year 2050. Sit back, relax, take a deep breath, because I'll be darned if it's not stressful out here right now. I don't mean in this room. This has been great, Shannon. But seriously, on the planet right now, there's a little bit of stress. So sit back, take a deep breath, and give yourself permission to go to the year 2050. We're all still alive. That's a miracle unto itself. And if we're all still alive in 2050, let me tell you something. It is going to be very, very different. Take a second deep breath, and you have 30 seconds of silence. Imagine life for yourself and those around you on planet Earth in 2050. And I advise you, if you are struggling with that, to be mindful that it is the imagination that allows us to create, to be the creators that we are. And we are creating our own reality in every moment. So I see education institutions and businesses in the spirit of cooperation, shifting from the worldview that is fast dissolving around competition, although I'm going to ask Kai to say one line about competition in a second, from competition and separation and containment and all of that we've done really well. We've really learned to be individuals. Its use-by date is up. The emergent worldview has to do with cooperation and unit of consciousness and synthesis and learning to be together where we actually offer our unique contribution on behalf of the common good. That's going to change. That's a game changer. That's a game changer. So my final 10 seconds, I yield to the gentleman to my left. Kai, and just say that. Competition means?
The original meaning, the etymology of the word competition is competere, to achieve more together. It's the complete opposite of the cultural meaning which we've given to it.
And that's how I coach softball.
I want to be on your team.
Yes. Everybody's on my team.
Thanks very much. And that's extremely interesting. About competere, because I've never understood why the French word for competition is concurrence, which I have always thought meant in English that you did something together. And it took me a little while to understand international concurrence, what it actually was being referred to there because of that. Mr. Dombach.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be back in Cleveland. My family's from this part of the country, so and I've lived here. Used to live here many years ago.
Welcome home.
Thank you. Good to be here. I run an organization called the Alliance for Peace Building, and before I get into looking at the future, the basic theme behind that is merging the word peace and building, so that peace is not just something that we wish for and hope for and pray for and even march in the streets for. It's something that you actually work for and design and build in a way that you know will last. That's what peace building is all about. So, and the reason I'm optimistic about the future is that we're beginning to understand that it is possible to build peace. And I'll come back to that in a second, because I have to start off with the negative side, because you asked us to do that. What is the worst that could happen? Well, the worst that could happen is total annihilation. I mean, we have the capacity to do that. That's the worst case scenario. And we've come to the precipice of that at a time or two in the past, and there is reason to believe that we could come to that precipice again, and we could even go over that precipice Yes, it could happen, and there are enormous pressures that could drive societies to that level. And so, if nothing else, there's a lot of talk about using fear in politics. If there is a good use of the concept of fear, and that would be fear of reaching that precipice and going over that precipice. I think the extent to which we're afraid that that could happen may very well cause some people who might otherwise want to continue in a conflict environment to say, wait a second, let's back off from that. That is utter nonsense. No one wins. And in fact, I think the thing that has changed in the last few decades is a growing recognition that no one wins anymore in violent conflict. It used to be that you could make a pretty good case that your society would be better off if you could conquer another piece of territory and get access to their resources. That used to happen. I don't like the fact that it was done, but it was done, and successfully. I think it's dreadful that it was done that way, but it was done successfully. Name a place where somebody has conquered some other piece of territory in the last 50 years where it was positive, where the outcome was positive. Hasn't happened. Doesn't happen anymore. So are the people who were in positions to make decisions about war and peace are beginning to think, wait a second, maybe this isn't such a good idea. The basic message that I convey when I'm involved in negotiation situations, and I've been in several, and we've been very successful, with a very simple message. What are the odds that you will prevail? Compared with the odds of you getting at least much of what you would want if you go through a negotiated process. In fact, 90% of violent conflicts now are resolved at the negotiating table. What I say to the belligerents when I'm talking with them is, let's bypass the death and violence and destruction and go straight to the negotiated settlement. Why not? And you know what? I've seen them do it, including some people you've read about in the newspapers being some of the most despised people on the planet. I know them on a first-name basis, and I've gotten them to do that. It can be done. So I'm optimistic. The main reason I'm optimistic is that is two things. One of them is there is a changing attitude on the part of the broad population worldwide. Two quick stories about that. One, the border war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Deeply involved, meeting with the heads of state of the two countries and helping them come to terms. I got to know the people in the diaspora from Ethiopia and Eritrea, and I would talk with them and say, what do you want out of all of this? Virtually without exception, said, we want a peaceful resolution. The Ethiopians didn't say, we want to conquer those damn Eritreans. They didn't say that. Said, we want peace. Talk with the Eritreans, what do you want out of this? We want the war to be over. None of this nonsense, we got to beat those horrible Ethiopians. Nonsense. Said, we want peace. That was the message that I was able to convey to the heads of state when I met with them. Your people don't want this war. They don't want you to win, don't want you to lose, don't want you to win either. They just want you to get it over with. And in the Congo, worked with the rebel groups and with President Kabila, and at the Inter-Congolese Dialogue, I had the opportunity to meet with virtually every one of the 250 delegates to the Inter-Congolese Dialogue. And these represented the various factions in civil society and so on. Asked every single one of them when I met with them, what did your family and friends say to you before you came here? And they didn't say, don't give up too much, make sure you just hold firm to your position. Not one of them said that. They said, don't come back without a peace agreement. Every single one of them said, my family said, don't come home without a peace agreement. Think about the implications of that. There is a changing attitude developing throughout the world that is saying war is stupid, irrational, and not likely to be successful. But we've got to find, in order to avoid war, we've got to find alternatives to it, and that's what peace building is all about. And one of the remarkable things that is happening is there are now hundreds of peace studies programs here in the United States, thousands of peace studies programs around the world, and what we're doing now, this never happened before in history. We are now studying war not to figure out how to win the next one, we're studying war to find out how to prevent the next one. That did not happen 50 years ago. Didn't happen 100 years ago. All of the studies were on how we can win the next one, how we can be the conquering heroes. Now we're taking a totally different look at it, and we're studying how to prevent it. Just one quick reference to one example of this that is, to me, is one of the most important new developments of all. There's something called the Global Peace Index that ranks the countries of the world based on their peacefulness, created by Steve Killalay from Sydney, Australia, one of my best friends in the world. I love this guy. He is amazing. A high school dropout who developed the software that enables Wall Street to use computers. Developed the software that enables ATM machines to talk with each other. He made a lot of money out of it. But he puts $5 million a year into development projects in the poorest countries of the world, and recognized that the poorest countries of the world are poor because they're still fighting wars. He said, well, we got to do something about the violence. He comes at it from a totally different angle than all of us who've been involved in this. We all look at what can we do about the violence. Steve is kind of into health wellness, just in his own personal life. He said, well, what about the peaceful countries? What can we learn from the peaceful countries? So he created the Global Peace Index because he asked, who are the peaceful countries? Nobody could give him an answer. Nobody knew. Nobody ever looked at that. They're never in the news. We don't know who they are. So he created the Global Peace Index, got the Economist Intelligence Unit. There is no better research and analysis outfit in the world than the Economist Intelligence Unit. They're not a bunch of lefties, softies. These are hard-nosed business people. They put together a team of experts, came up with a set of criteria. They did the ranking. We now know who the most peaceful countries are. We've always known who the least peaceful are. They're in the news all the time. We now know who the most peaceful countries are, and we know what their characteristics are. And I'll bet not a person in this room can guess what the leading correlation is between the countries at peace and the countries that are the most violent. It's corruption. Corruption. Who would have thought? And yet there's almost a straight line on this, on a scatter chart, where you put where the countries are both in terms of corruption and violence. It's almost a straight line. There's a few outliers, but it's almost a straight line. New Zealand happens to be the most peaceful country in the world. It's also the least corrupt country in the world. Afghanistan and Iraq happen to be the most corrupt countries in the world, and they happen to be the most violent countries in the world. And you just go all along the chart to see that. Well, now we know that. Maybe we can put more effort into overcoming corruption. Now, there are several other factors. So we've now identified what it takes for countries to live at peace. And let me finish up by referring to something that Harriet Fulbright and I did a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. It was November 1st of 2009. We produced the first global symposium of peaceful nations in history. No one has ever, ever, ever done anything special to honor countries for being peaceful. We did it. Used the Global Peace Index, divided the world into 9 regions. If we took the top 10, as we said to the Danish ambassador, we could hold it in Copenhagen. Their neighbors could walk in and we would have a party, but nobody else would care. So we divided the world into 9 regions. Took the 2 most peaceful countries in each of those 9 regions, and by the way, 2 countries that are on this panel were honored at that celebration. Vietnam and Japan were among the most peaceful countries in the world. We gave them a nice award, had a banquet in their honor, but we also asked the delegates to spend the next 2 days telling us how did they do it. Because the main thing I run into is people saying, Chick, you're an idealistic fool, and they're absolutely right. I'm an idealistic fool out trying to build peace. But they say, people have always gone to war, they always will go to war, and there's nothing you can do about it. Say, look at these 18 countries that we just honored. They're not going to war. They figured out how to live at peace. If they can do it, and they're all better for it. You also look at the living standards, at the Human Development Index, and all the other things. They all rank up there near the top. It's the peaceful countries that rank up near the top. If they can do it, why can't the rest? And it's that kind of new way of looking that is starting to penetrate even the minds of the leaders. I get to lecture at West Point regularly. And every time I go up there, the people with stars on their shoulders look at me and say, we want you to succeed. We want you to succeed. We don't want to shoot people, and we certainly don't want people shooting at us. Let's work together and make this happen. So because of that, I'm optimistic that in the year 2050, we may not be all the way there, but we'll be a lot more peaceful.
Hear, hear.
Thanks very much. And may I say that quite apart from the optimism, it seems very important to me that you're laying out some historical events or benchmarks, making events in a field of information, data, news, whatever, that we don't always think of as actually being a history or actually being events. I mean, that these are, he's actually finding milestones in a terrain that we didn't think necessarily had milestones, because we always identify the milestones with the events of war rather than the events of peace. So I very much appreciate that. Dr. French.
Well, I have been enjoying all of the other panels very, very much, and I actually feel a little bit silly being on a panel here, because I feel like I'm mostly in the host role here and just trying to bring these extraordinary people to all of you so that you can hear from them. But I would like to just echo some of the points and hopefully draw a few of them together for those of you who weren't able, since many of you have jobs and other things you have to do, classes you have to go to, you weren't able to be at all 6 of the other panels. One of the themes that came out that is relevant to your question about where will we be 40 years from now, the theme of whether or not conflict is something inherent within the human spirit, within human nature. And a point that was made very strongly that really resonated with me was that, yes, perhaps conflict is, but conflict need not result in violence. And we've heard some more echoings of that point, that there are other ways to resolve conflict. And whether we're hearing about that in terms of, on the corporate panel, when some of the panelists this afternoon were making the point that we associate wars with greed, and there's a reason for that. But at the same time, more and more, even the multinational corporations that we are often tempted to totally demonize, more and more of them are realizing that even if it is just about business, war can be the worst for business. War is not getting them where they need to be. So you put that together with the points we've heard already from my fellow panelists here, that the people who are in conflict, what they want out of that conflict, you can identify that and say, these are your goals. Getting to those goals is not best done through the path of violence. It takes them further away from where they want to be, and they lose blood and treasure. So I do have a concern when I look, 40 years from now, do I imagine a completely peaceful planet? I do have a concern that there will still be those who have not learned that the best way to resolve the conflict, to get what they actually want, is to avoid violence. But I do have hope and I do have optimism in that I do see moral progress, both in the sense of education, broadening our minds and understanding about different cultures, but also very specifically, I'm an ethicist, a philosopher. I'm excited to see that we have seen some universal truths being accepted, whether it's captured in international law yet or just as a universal consensus, that show that we have learned something from the past. We haven't learned enough yet, but we have learned something. And let me give you a concrete example. The point was made in another of our earlier panels that although we no longer have slavery in the old traditional sense understood, we still have this enormous amount of human trafficking, which is the same thing under a different name or different guise. And if you look at that by itself, you think, oh, humanity, there's no hope here. But what I would point out is, if you talk about human trafficking in any forum, not just this forum with a lot of people who are interested in peace and the future, in any forum, in an international setting, you are not going to have anyone standing up and saying, I think human trafficking is great, I think we should all do it, I'm doing it out in the open, and I see no reason why anyone should criticize me for it. It at least has gotten to the point where we know and we all agree it's wrong. There's still people doing this thing that they know full well is wrong, and there are still pressures and systems in place that make it all too easy for them to do this thing that is wrong. But at the time when we think of as the traditional eras of slavery, there were not those voices so clear and obvious saying, come on, this is a no-brainer. Slavery is dead wrong. Those were the fringe voices saying, yeah, I have a problem with this. But those voices got louder, and more people got together and said, this is unacceptable. And now we say slavery is unacceptable, to the point that even the people who are doing human trafficking don't want it called that, because we all agree that if you call it slavery, it's wrong. Genocide is another example. It depresses me when I see people arguing about whether something is or is not genocide, if they're using that as an excuse whether or not to intervene, whether or not to help. But what gives me this little spark of hope, I'm trying to see it sometimes, it's hard, but what gives me that hope is if you can get them to call it that, they know that's wrong. And again, there was a time in our human history where people didn't see that as wrong, where they saw it as a right that you could destroy an entire people, where they saw it as a destiny. So I am hopeful that we do see some moral progress. But when I look out at the young faces, and we do love seeing some of these, not to dismiss the older faces, but when I look out at the youth in this audience, I want to put a charge to you. You have more access than any other generation did to knowledge about the other, to knowledge about the whole world. And I think what I've learned from talking to young people today is that that can be overwhelming. And in a curious sense, it can be an obstacle to the kind of outrage that is necessary to get things permanently labeled as wrong so that we will never do them again. And so I charge to each of you, I know it's hard to care about the whole world. It's too big. It's overwhelming. You see news story after news story, and you think, I'm empty. I can't feel another thing. And so you turn to your inner world or your small circle, and you live there. But if we challenge one another to care beyond ourselves, to take that extra step, that painful extra step, to look people in the eye and hear their stories and see the pain and see what's out there, it allows us to hold on to something that the Greek philosopher Aristotle called a virtue, and that's righteous anger. You know, we don't always think of anger as a virtue, but righteous anger can be a virtue if it motivates you to continue to care and to continue to act, to say, I know I can't fix everything. That is too much. But I'm not going to take as my response to not being able to fix everything, I can't do anything. I'm going to make every little bit of difference that I can make. And when I get exhausted, I'm going to turn to others and say, help me, or help move this forward. I need to heal. But I'm going to keep pushing and saying that if I change here and change a little bit there and continue to have a voice and a say, I can move things forward towards a progress. So I hope that 40 years from now, we see other signs of human progress in that we agree more and more on what can never be done again. And while there will be pockets of those bad things still being done, we can collectively agree that those are the things we're addressing, and that we all want to see them gone, whether it's poverty or various forms of disrespect based on gender and other differences among us. If we can work on that and move forward on that, I think that the world my daughter will see, I have a 3-year-old daughter, will be better than the one we're in right now.
Thanks very much, Shannon. Your comments put me in mind of the philosopher, this happens often with me, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who was the author of one of the first 18th century proposals for perpetual peace. And in another essay he said, sort of like Shannon did, that we do not live in an enlightened age, but we live in an age of enlightenment in which there is progress on certain moral ideals, even if people don't observe them all the time. So I think it's your turn, Mr. Jakobsen, to give us your perspective.
Thank you.
What do you think is going to happen?
First, I'd just like to say that it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with everybody and together with this extraordinary panel. It's a time for righteous anger and for awesome and determined hope and inspired commitment. I love the title of this panel because those who know me usually say that my short-term view is 50 years. So this is, I think, a little shorter than I would normally look at. But so far in the course of time that we've been here since this morning today, somewhere between 30 to 40,000 people have been killed around the world from lack of access to medicines which exist in abundance and clean water which is easily provided. They won't make it to 2050. So far in the time that we've been in this room today, several hundred women have been raped all over the world, usually by someone in their family or somebody that they know and should have a trusted relationship with. I was in Jerusalem just over a year ago, and on the wall of Gershon Baskin, who, for those working the field, is a name widely known in peace education, peace work, he had a quote which was the first thing I thought of when I saw the name of this panel today, and that was, the best way to predict the future is to make it. I want to bring in some perspectives to complement what we've heard and to look at some sides that we haven't spoken too much about. When doing that, I'm reminded of a speech I heard in the British Parliament. It was mentioned that I'm an advisor on peace building to an all-party parliamentary group in the British Parliament, which for the first time in the history of the existence of Britain is an actual capability at the level of Parliament, cutting across all parties to help make sure that parliamentarians have access to a diverse range of perspectives, understanding, and information about conflict issues and peace building. And it includes the most senior military officers of the British military and some of the most capable and experienced practitioners in peace building and mediation. We had a presentation by Rear Admiral William Perry, who at the time was the head of the strategic forecasting unit of the British military, looking at identifying threats as they see them 30 years down the road. What I remember is Rear Admiral William Perry is an extraordinarily intelligent, capable, and educated individual. The quality of his PowerPoint presentation was awing. His references to Greek culture and civilization, his Shakespearean quotes, the depth and breadth of his knowledge was sparkling. At the end of his presentation, a veteran of the Second World War, well into his 90s, stood up and he said, "I'm extremely happy that I will be dead in a few years and won't have to live to see what you're predicting." What he predicted was, to use the term mildly, terrifying. It was also sad in that the entire framework of logic of every kernel of his presentation was the same as a 1950s extremist war culture and war ideology approach. Everything that he identified as a threat was negative when they did it, and everything he identified as a solution was the exact same thing, the difference being that we should do it. But the basic logic would lead us to the same place. We spend $1.48 trillion a year now on the production and maintenance of weapons and armies. That's more than $3 million a minute. That's a 48% increase in the last 10 years. I agree with every single word that Chick said. And I love it and I celebrate it, where we work very much along similar lines. At the same time, the increase in capability and focus within our field and of support and operationalization of it, investment in it, is minuscule. It is awesome. The learning curve in this field is like this. Even if I just think 10 years ago, it is extraordinary. But I would say 5% of our application on the ground approaches competence. 95% is often quite poor. The overwhelming majority of peace studies programs, it's extraordinary that they've increased. Our task now is to constructively engage with them and make them better. But the quality of most of them, I teach at most of the most well-known ones around the world. And I ask the graduate students every time, do you feel you now have the capability to engage and to do this? And except for the 1 out of every 1,000 who's usually more naive or arrogant than realistic, most say no. Imagine if we were graduating doctors who don't know how to perform. Imagine if we were graduating pilots who don't know how to perform. We need to put in place practical, operational, relevant skills, not just particular approaches of ideology and perspectives. 250 richest people in the world, mainly men, have more wealth than the 2.25 poorest human beings in the world put together. The 3 richest men in the world have more wealth than the 48 poorest countries in the world put together. On average, every year, about 740,000 people are killed through direct acts of violence, homicidal violence and war. And what we don't actually realize in this field is the overwhelming majority of those people are not killed in countries in war. Not killed in the Congo, not killed in Somalia, not killed in Sri Lanka or elsewhere. The deaths in those areas are astronomical. But the overwhelming majority of people killed through armed violence are killed in countries like the United States, Mexico, Brazil, Kenya. Through interpersonal violence, homicide, and gang-related violence. So I agree entirely with Shannon. Conflict is normal, and I did this earlier today, but I'll do it again. Is there anyone in this room who's never experienced a conflict? No, sincerely, don't be shy, because I will have you on international news and media everywhere by tomorrow. I've asked tens of thousands of people. All of us have conflicts. That's normal. It's not necessary. We don't need to have every conflict we have, as my wife and I discuss sometimes. But it is normal. Violence is what happens when we systematically fail to deal with conflicts effectively and when we invest extraordinary human and financial scientific capabilities in the direction of violence. So we invest to make it possible. Just to give a few other brief statistics, between 1990 and 2005, over $250 billion worth of infrastructure was destroyed on continental Africa because of war. That exceeds all aid flows to Africa during that period. But just in case we're under the incredibly incorrect, naive illusion that we're actually aiding and assisting Africa, for every $1 that goes to continental Africa from industrially developed countries, $25 is transferred from Africa to countries like the United States and the European Union. There is a gigantic global system of subsidy. There's a gigantic transfer of wealth. But it is not our naive, we're helping Africa or elsewhere. They're funding your lifestyle and my lifestyle. The reason I'm saying these figures is because when we're asking what will happen in 2050, I like to look at what's happening now and where are we coming from over the last 40 years. And the trend that we're seeing is a dramatic and intensifying and increasing concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands. An increasing capacity of the means of production, our ability to create and produce is beyond things that we have ever even imagined before. But we are literally having mountains of goods go to waste. The amount that's thrown out from supermarkets in the United States every day exceeds all food assistance in the world put together. So our waste is extraordinary. We are having a dramatic, unchecked, and for the large part unrecognized and unknown increase in the influence of extreme military factions. I don't actually mean serving soldiers or officers, but I mean militarization, largely fueled by weapons industry, and the role and power of corporations, which most of us in this room would pale even to consider the extent of it. We have an increasing non-transparent and non-accountable use of power. We've glibly and superficially looked at the spread of so-called democracy by elections every 4 or 5 years in the last 20 years. But also the actual power and control of citizens over the function of their governments has in many areas been reduced. And one of the greatest impacts of September 11th, 2001 was both restrictions on a wide breadth of civil liberties, expansion dramatically in the surveillance role of states and corporations, but also one of the largest transfers of wealth in recorded history from taxpayers to private mercenary corporations and private industry. So those are some of the challenges. When Dodd is saying that it is a system that's collapsing, it is also a system which currently is an unchecked systemic expansion. And I've had the good fortune or the misfortune to look over several thousand years of history and have the chance to see how many times before we thought, oh, the system's going to collapse. And one thing that you see is some types of systems are remarkably tenacious and have unfortunate capacity to keep on giving long after you might wish they didn't. Moving on, it was mentioned revolutions in military affairs, which I find to be an extraordinarily interesting concept. I was speaking at the request of the Catalan Parliament just about a year ago to the Catalan president and with the head of the Ministry of Defense Training College of the Spanish military. And we were discussing with a very, very large audience together. And looking at the Napoleonic Wars, where there were a few major revolutions in the application of force. One was conscription, moving from private mercenary armies, which we're returning to mass enlistment and dramatically increasing the capability to apply force in terms of mass concentration of troops. Two was the mass concentration of artillery and cannon fire, which was relatively new and had not been used before in that way. Three was the mobilization of the entire nation for war. The grandparents and the elderly men would go into the village center and mobilize and encourage people. The young and elderly women would sew uniforms and prepare food packages. And there's a brilliant speech of that time which speaks about the value of little children because their fingers, they can fit in very nicely to clean the shells. Yeah. So everyone can play a role. And another revolution in military affairs at the time was the establishment of the general staff. You ask most officers and enlisted soldiers today, they'll think the general staff has always existed. No, it hasn't. It was introduced by Napoleon at a very limited role. Then Moltke Sr. and Moltke Jr. in the German military brought it forward. It was only at the time of the First World War that it became general. The reason I'm saying that is because in the area of military technology, some of the things that we consider basic today were invented over time and did not exist at one point. So we've evolved it. I would suggest that the most relevant revolution in military affairs today, if we look at Karl von Clausewitz, who said that war is the continuation of politics by other means, the point of war was seen as being to achieve a legitimate goal. Peace, security, or at one time, expansion and greater profit. But most people accept or see war as legitimate because we believe it's actually serving a legitimate purpose. But let's take a step back from that instrument. Let's take a step back from saying that it's war which is the way of doing it, and look at what are we trying to achieve. And if what we're trying to achieve is peace, security, well-being, then one thing we know de facto is that the application of military force today increases insecurity. The application of military force today escalates the very issues which it's supposed to be solving. The definition of insanity, or one of them, is the absence of a feedback loop, the absence of the ability to learn from repeated applications and to process that information. We need to transcend our insanity and to recognize that whereas a few thousand years ago we said, si vis pare pace parum bellum, if you wish for peace, prepare for war. Perhaps today we need to recognize, if you wish for peace, we need to prepare for peace. Do I have just a few moments more? Would it be okay? I'll try and be really, really brief.
Yeah, sure.
Just very few. Some actual examples to inspire. Smallpox. How many of you have seen it? Most of you may have seen some pictures, probably not. Smallpox is what most people believe, most doctors believe, is what was referred to in the Bible as the plague. It was the greatest killer in the existence of the human species. More than 500 million people killed as a result of smallpox. For most of our species' interaction with smallpox, we believed that it was the will of God, which sort of puts it in that category of things you can't do that much about. It's beyond our power. Slowly, over a long period, we studied medicine, and we learned about medicine. And then over a period, we invented a cure to smallpox. And then in the 1970s and 80s, the United Nations organized the largest army it had ever created in its history up until that point, an army of 150,000 doctors and medical practitioners from over 100 countries around the world. And they eradicated smallpox, except in a few military labs in Russia, Israel, the United States, and China. But they largely got rid of it, something which we thought was impossible. Just 400 or 500 years ago, up until 200 years ago in some parts of Western Europe, we were killing people, burning them to death, killing them at the stake, beheading them, different means, for studying human anatomy. It was seen as satanic practice. Today, one of the best things you can do is study to be a doctor and to study human anatomy. And we don't tell doctors that they're naive or idealistic, but why would you study medicine? It's human nature to die. Well, yes, it is. Doctors study medicine out of responsibility, a recognition that there's something that is afflicting and affecting us and wanting to make it better. And it's the same thing in peace building and working to understand how we can engage with conflicts more effectively. Just the very, very last things, an alternative vision. Peace education at every level of schools. We all learn basic hygiene because we recognize for the well-being of societies and individuals, we all need to know it. We all learn basic maths because it doesn't matter whether you'll be a panelist or a soldier or a journalist or an artist or whatever you might be, it helps all of us. All of us have conflicts. Imagine if we were learning about how to deal with it more effectively in our personal lives, in our businesses, in our communities, internationally. We have ministries which deal with sports. We have ministries which deal with medicine. We have ministries which deal with urban planning, with war, or departments in the United States. Imagine building from local to federal level government capabilities for dealing with conflicts effectively. I look forward to the day, and I have tremendous respect for those who serve, and I hope we can make that service meaningful. But I look forward to the day when the only place someone can look to understand what is a soldier is in a museum, and where everyone knows what it means to be a peace worker. War is too important to leave in the hands of military and politicians. It affects every one of us. 3 visions of 2050, a continuation of today, which means extraordinary inequalities globally, some areas living in a lot of peace and getting ranked highly for it, but also many areas where people are dying in the hundreds of thousands every single day. All of that, that's today, that but intensified for 2050. Or virtual, total, or close to it, annihilation. That's the direction we're moving most enthusiastically in at the moment. That's the direction which results from the policies Michael spoke about this morning. Or the abolition of war, the abolition of the industries that support war, the abolition of the fundamentally anti-democratic political and economic systems which make war possible, and the evolution by the choice and actions of every one of us in this room of capabilities to deal with conflicts more effectively and by peaceful means. And just to end with a few quotes. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Not a quote, but it's time for a paradigm shift. From what we think is the way the world is, to recognizing the way the world can be. And historically, paradigm shifts have only happened because people have made them happen. I see, as I mentioned this morning, a massive requirement for a democratic struggle to put forward demos kratos, people's power. I don't understand our obsession of speaking about businesses. I do see businesses as having an important role. I see pensioners as having an important role. I see unions as having an important role. Do I want children and youth involved? Yes, and I want every generation involved, because it will take all of us. The last quote, Caminante no hay camino. El camino se hace al andar. Traveler, there is no road. The road is made as one walks. What the world will look like in 2050 depends on what you choose to do when you walk out of this room today. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much to all of our panelists for some very thought-provoking, sobering, but also inspiring reflections on the past and on the present and future as well, and even on the length of time that's appropriate for thinking about these kinds of matters. At this point, I would like to open the floor. If anybody has questions for the panelists, please use the microphones that are provided.
Or microphone.
Or the microphone, yes. I think there's one at this point. And state your name, please, so that the panelists are able to engage with you.
So as people are thinking about that and getting up, may I make a
Sure,
comment?
absolutely. And otherwise, let's continue the conversation,
Great.
because now people can join in.
Great. It seems to me there's a game changer going on, and everyone has alluded to it. You know, where we think of ourselves as Homo sapiens, and then and that means we can reason and we know, and we're beyond animals as a result. And then there are those scientists who clearly name us as Homo sapiens sapiens, because today we know that we know. I mean, that's like amazing. Well, I'm going to submit to you, based on many conversations with fine thinkers, we're on the threshold of being something else. We know that we know, and what we know is that we are one. And when we get that, when we grok that, that's a game changer. And then it's a domino effect. And the other thing I'd like to say, and Shannon, when you're saying that we don't do these things anymore, then to be able to point that out, every time in our human history, and let's just take the last few hundred years, that a major question has been asked by humanity, a shift occurs. And it's not always perfect, and there's always questions about it, as you've pointed out well. But we go to abolition and slavery. We go to the suffragettes, and the women can vote. Well, in the UN today, and in Spain, in Barcelona, right now, the biggest question that's being focused on in many areas is peace a human right? That's a question on the floor that's being debated, and that's very hopeful, isn't it? Here comes the shift. And Kai, thank you for the final comment, for everything, and for the final comment regarding it really is up to us. And it's not a cliche anymore that we're the ones we've been waiting for.
I would also like to just briefly echo something that Kai said. And I made my comment about the youth, but something that has been a subtle theme in this week-long summit that I'd like to bring to the forefront of your attention is actually intergenerational work. You know, I was singling out the youth only because I'm a teacher and I think of them as my audience so often. But it's absolutely the case that we cannot move forward unless we are all working together. And we have such strengths at so many different ages and experience levels. And we need to have those cross-generational conversations and learn from each other. And I point out, forgive me for being a bit of an advertisement, but this evening, as a culminating event before our final discussion tomorrow, there is a choir presentation, and it is an intergenerational peace choir. And the reason we put that together was to just symbolically show this idea of, you know, from the youngest to the oldest, if the voices are together and we're learning from each other, we can move forward in a positive direction, and we can do the thing that I referenced of helping each other when we feel helpless, helping each other when we feel like we can't make a difference. Because people who have been there can remind the youth that hey, you know, I took a stand and something did change. And the youth can remind those who say, I've worked so long and I don't see enough change. They can say, we're here and we're going to carry the burden with you now. Don't give up. So, you know, that intergenerational conversation is a big part of what we're trying to do here. I think
thanks.
Comment
you had a comment.
Yes, I have a little bit comment on war by Clausewitz. Kai mentioned about the Clausewitz on war. Maybe this is my personal perspective. Clausewitz theory is only for the politicians and military high-rank officers who love the war, because the on war is the Bible for them. Clausewitz justified the war on war.
Absolutely.
I think so.
Absolutely.
So we know the conventional war, traditional war was over in the 20th century. So we should create the other theory, maybe.
Someone needs to write on
Yeah,
peace.
that's my comment.
Good one.
Thanks. Did you want to add
Yes,
an
did you
additional
want to-
comment with assistance?
Việt Nam là một đất nước ở trong khu vực ASEAN, tức là vùng văn hóa phương Đông. Mà các bạn biết là phương Đông và phương Tây thì khác nhau. Hiện giờ là ASEAN là một khu vực mà rất là phát triển. Thì nước tôi cũng là một trong những nước của ASEAN và cũng đang phát triển. Do vậy chúng tôi đang gặp những vấn đề về sự thách thức của sự phát triển. Và trong cái thách thức đấy thì có hai loại thách thức. Một loại thách thức là mang tính chất hòa bình, tức là cạnh tranh lẫn nhau về kinh tế rồi văn hóa. Loại thách thức thứ hai là có thể dẫn đến xung đột, tức là dẫn đến chiến tranh. Vì các nước khác nhau về quyền lợi thì có thể diễn ra hai việc. Một là quan hệ hòa bình, hai là quan hệ chiến tranh. Thế nước tôi phải giải quyết cái vấn đề bằng cách nào? Thí dụ cách thứ nhất là chúng tôi cùng phát triển hòa bình. Còn cách thứ hai là phải giữ cho được cái gọi là cái đường biên giới của nước mình ấy không bị chiến tranh xâm lược. Vì quan điểm của Việt Nam là phát triển về kinh tế, chính trị, về văn hóa, nhưng không xâm lược, không có cái vụ gọi là xâm lược biên giới. Chính vì vậy nguyên tắc của chúng tôi là giữ đúng cái tinh thần của một nước phát triển trong vùng Đông Nam Á. Và rất có thể là chúng tôi đề nghị Hoa Kỳ với tư cách là những người bạn. Giữa chúng ta đã có một cuộc chiến tranh và bây giờ chiến tranh đã kết thúc rồi, thì cả hai dân tộc đều bận tâm xây dựng hòa bình. Và Hoa Kỳ có thể giúp đỡ chúng tôi một số việc, thí dụ giải quyết vấn đề Biển Đông. Vì Biển Đông có thể nhờ cái sự giúp đỡ của Hoa Kỳ và cái việc giải quyết nó sẽ được tốt hơn. Thứ hai, thí dụ những vấn đề liên quan giữa hai nước là vấn đề chất độc màu da cam, thì Hoa Kỳ cũng nên giúp đỡ Việt Nam giải quyết cái vấn đề chất độc màu da cam, vì đó là những hậu quả của chiến tranh. Và cuối cùng thì tôi có một vấn đề tôi cũng rất là thích, là ở Hoa Kỳ có một vấn đề được đặt ra sau hậu chiến, tức là sau chiến tranh ấy, là vấn đề mà các bạn nói suốt từ đầu đến giờ là PTSD. Thì vấn đề đấy nó trong mối quan hệ giữa Hoa Kỳ và Việt Nam thì PTSD đối với Hoa Kỳ là rất là khủng khiếp, nhưng đối với Việt Nam thì vấn đề lại giải quyết bằng cách khác. Vậy chúng ta có thể cùng nhau hợp tác để giải quyết PTSD giữa hai bên bằng văn hóa, và theo tôi thấy thì bằng văn học và nghệ thuật là tốt nhất. Tôi thấy cái hôm đầu tiên mà chúng ta có đọc thơ ấy, thì tôi thấy là cái cách đấy làm cho PTSD của Mỹ tốt hơn. Và không phải ngẫu nhiên mà những người lính Mỹ giải quyết PTSD bằng cách về Việt Nam. Và thí dụ như trường hợp của ông Ethic dẫn cựu chiến binh Mỹ về Việt Nam, và PTSD đối với họ sẽ đỡ căng thẳng hơn. Tôi ao ước rằng các bạn là những chuyên gia nghiên cứu về PTSD ở Mỹ sẽ có hợp tác về giáo dục với Việt Nam ở các trường đại học. Tôi cho rằng là một chuyên gia ở Mỹ rất tốt về PTSD và giải quyết ở trường đại học tổng hợp, thí dụ trường đại học của tôi chẳng hạn, dạy cái môn đó, thì nó sẽ là một cái môn học giải quyết tốt nhất cái quan hệ giữa hai nước. Và các bạn có thể học hỏi chúng tôi về kinh nghiệm chữa những cái hậu quả của chiến tranh, và chúng tôi cũng có thể học hỏi các bạn về chuyện giải quyết PTSD như thế nào. Được chưa?
Now for a translation.
She said, I'm not going to make a comment, but I'd just like to add a few words about the vision of our planet in 40 years from now. Vietnam is a developing country, and we are in the Asian. And we have some problems of our own, particularly the problem of developing countries. We want to develop the country in such a way that we still keep the national identity. We don't want to lose the national identity, but it's always a conflict between developing and preserving the national identity. And also, in developing the economy, we have the challenges which can lead to war if we don't know how to solve the problem in a peaceful way. For example, in Vietnam nowadays, we have the problem of the East Sea, which you call the South China Sea. We call it the East Sea. And we have to deal with China about a lot of problems regarding the South China Sea. So what happened in 40 years later? How can we solve the conflict in the East Sea? It's not only the conflict between China and Vietnam, but also the other countries in the Asian. And also I'm thinking about the cooperation between Vietnam and the United States. After the war, now Vietnam and the United States are friends. And the United States can help Vietnam in many aspects. For example, the presence of the U.S. in the East Sea can be a good element to bring peace. And also, I'm thinking about the problem that you call the PTSD. And I know that the Americans have a lot of experience in healing the war wounds and to solve the problem of PTSD. And recently, Dr. Dick has led a group of American veterans visiting Vietnam. And in my opinion, it is a very successful trip that can heal the wounds of the war. But 40 years from now, it's not only no more Vietnam War veterans, but you can have the veterans from the other world. Iraq, Afghanistan, and who else? We never know. But we have to think about that. So we, at this point, we don't have any problem. We don't have war at this point. But in 40 years later, whoever knows? So Vietnam need to share the experience with the United States, with Americans about PTSD. We want to learn from you. And we believe that we can share some of our experience for you regarding the PTSD. So I think that the American universities and my universities can have cooperation regarding that problem. So that's my last word. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Now we're going to open to questions from the floor. Please state your name and please try and be concise. And actually, one possibility is some of you who are of like minds might be able to cooperate on a question. That way we can get more questions in together, although I'm not sure whether that'll work. But anyway, you go first as solo because that's a brand new proposition. So.
Hi, my name is Daria with the National Peace Academy and the MK Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence. So Amelia Rotary talks about how power, which she defines as the ability for one to achieve one's desired goal or an end, is intricately related to imagination. And we kind of touched on this, that in order to control a population, you constrain its imagination. You constrain what it can believe, what it believes its relationships are to the institutions that surround it, to authoritarian governments, to the people around it. And at the same time, conversely, to liberate people, you allow it to expand its imagination. So you can imagine new institutions, new sets of relationships, and new futures. And I think the path to peace is kind of similar, as allowing ourselves to expand our imaginations. But one of the things I found, and then listening to a lot of the panels in the past few days, it's kind of frightening to see that, policymakers come up are under the impression that the international system works. The international system is Hobbesian, anarchic, and violent. Human nature, at its primal core, is supposed to be violent and brutal and cruel, and that we must be pragmatic. We must be cynical, and we must be thinking in ways that are possible. And so the question I have then is, what are the steps that we must take to unblock our imagination? Amelia Rorty says that the most powerful people in the world are poets, because poets have the ability to not be constrained by the expectations of their audience, but rather tap into truth and express that truth. And so, how do we unchain ourselves from the shadows of pragmatism, from Hobbesian logic and irrational and the logic of war that is necessary? And so I invite you as educators, as policymakers who are doing these things right now in the present, and as poets, to share your advice to free your imaginations.
I was just nodding to, we have in the audience David Hassler, the head of the Wick Poetry Center, who wrote the beautiful play that many of you saw. Your point about poets helping us all.
Go ahead, Chuck.
I'll comment on it if it's all right. I think that we who have an opportunity to speak and write and reach an audience need to try to help a broader public understand that that whole premise that violence is a fundamental part of human nature is not necessarily so. Conflict, yes, I think we all agree that conflict, yeah, that's going to happen. In fact, it can be a very positive thing. But the question I ask of people who say that violence is human nature, say, well, is that true of you? They say, well, no, not me. It's those other guys. Well, you go and talk to those other guys and say, are you inherently violent? I'm not inherently violent, it's those other guys. The fact of the matter is that most of history has been peaceful. Most of humanity lives in peace. The vast majority of humanity lives in peace. So how can we say that it is just a fundamental part of human nature to be violent? It's not. It's just not. There is reason to believe that there are some people who do have a propensity toward violence, and I think we do need to have ways of dealing with people like that. But there's every reason to believe that it is not endemic to human nature. What we study in history is the wars, just as what we read in the newspapers is about the wars. You don't read about the overwhelming majority of people who are living at peace. And I think we need to get that message out and help people understand that.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
Just very, very briefly on that. It is, I think, incredibly important for us to find ways of reaching out to people broadly. Conferences, lectures, training programs, all of that is fantastic, but we remain small pockets. We need to be innovative and creative and learn from the full spectrum of human experience how to organize, how to work effectively, how to get our messages out. How is it that you have literally had a small number of corporations seize extraordinary power in the last 50 years globally? They were brilliant. They organized, they planned, they prepared, and they carried out. They were able to affect it. They had the power to. I doubt that the majority of us are here because we want to just have an interesting event that makes us feel good for a little bit. We're probably here because somewhere inside of us we hope that it will be possible to achieve what we're doing. And I really want to echo what was said this morning in terms of professionalization and discipline. I want both dimensions. I want the explosion of reaching out to people as broadly as possible, and I really, really echo professionalization and discipline. And for people who get scared at those words, theater, ballet, musical performance are incredibly disciplined, and it is that discipline which lies at the heart of creativity. It's that discipline which gives us the ability of grace. The other side of it is I love innovation and design. I find it incredibly inspiring. If you don't know about TED.com already, look at TED.com. But there you see the human capacity to innovate, create. Imagine how much greater that will be when we're not using trillions of dollars of resources to produce instruments of destruction. And when we're not locked in this unconstructive and unhelpful approach to dealing with conflicts, but begin to enable our creativity to come up and to flow.
And you asked specifically about education and the imagination. And just briefly, what we know is that the field that we call peace education is still emergent. It's a babe in the woods. That's so hopeful and so exciting. It's just in the process of bringing that great spirit of peace through education into form and defining itself. And one of the key words that you'll hear any peace educator use is holistic education. So without going, that's a whole other conference on peace education sometime and what it means. And there are fabulous people in the field to talk about it. But the imagination is one of the keys, and we know that. We know that. And the only other thing I'd like to say is, if you're asking yourself or friends a question and you want to move through and move into that place of more creativity and more imagination, there's a major difference between asking what or why, which tends to keep us in the concrete kind of look at the form, questioning, fix it mode, and how. How will we do this?
It also implies it can be done.
Exactly. Which, by the way, Kenneth Boulding, Elise and Kenneth Boulding, and both of them were great educators and into conflict resolution and peace education. And Kenneth Boulding said, if it exists, it's possible. And it made me think of that when you were talking about all these great things.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Laura. Officially, this seat is for my president of the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, who published this book named The Grandfather, Please Teach Me the War. That word is his granddaughter, who was attending the U.S. high school at that time. And her teacher mentioned this. In the spring of 1998, I asked my history students to research a topic in 20th century history and conduct an interview with an eyewitness or participant in that history, and to then share that information with our class. How fortunate we were indeed that Keiko's grandfather graciously agreed to answer her questions. Keiko took an entire class period to spellbindingly read her grandfather's illuminating and moving account of World War II and U.S.-Japanese relations. I agree wholeheartedly with Keiko's grandfather, who said, "The important thing is to exchange and discuss different views to deepen our understanding of each other. After all, as human beings, we are all part of one another."
Okay. Beautiful.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you. My name's Austin. I'm an undergraduate student here at Case. It was mentioned sort of the universal desire for peace, which I'm sure is true. It was mentioned the universal desire for peace, which I'm sure is true. However, particularly in this country, there's almost an also universal desire for your own personal automobile, powerful cell phone, and other elements of a lifestyle, which either directly or indirectly cause conflict. In order for some of the more optimistic visions of peace in 40 years from now, how is lifestyle in the advanced world, how does that have to change, and is it likely to? Thank you.
It's a great question. Who would like to take a stab at it?
Seems like you again.
Simplify.
Well, but he asked also, is it possible? I mean, I do think that is one of our greater challenges. Again, I don't put it as a challenge that can't be met, but I do think it is one of our greater challenges because people don't like to give up what they have. So asking, to say simplify, there are some who embrace that and then they are very free once they've taken that step. But for someone who is very involved with their possessions and with their accumulation of things, to even ask them to imagine being happy without them is again this imagination issue is a big step, and then to have them think of a world where they wouldn't feel deprived or actually harmed in a way that they would seek retribution to have those things taken away is very, very difficult. So I'm afraid I'm not claiming to answer your question, but I just wanted to highlight that I think it is one of our greater challenges, because the more that people get used to having things, the harder it is for you to say to them, having those things is hurting other people. You need to give them up. That part of sacrifice, battling against entitlement, is very difficult. And I don't have the answer, but I'm glad you raised that to us, and I hope one of my fellow panelists can address it more directly.
It takes me to the how question, just to follow up on the, as you say that, to follow up on an initial word. I live in Vermont. And one of the great things that's happening there, as it is in many places around the country, is it's kind of a slow food and locavore and local food movement. And there's this wonderful community thing happening where from the intervale where organic food is grown that the hospital uses, and then the compost, I mean the food goes back into compost, and there's this great cyclic thing, and food doesn't get thrown out so much. It gets taken to a shelter or a soup kitchen or something like that, and it's really quite stunning what's happening all throughout community. And the how part for me is as we come in touch with that part of community and our humanity, and we end up giving and showing up at things where you're not going to be in touch with a television or a cell phone or a BlackBerry or something like that for a period of time, because you're actually with people doing things like I got an email the day before I left, can you come down and take some potatoes out because we're expecting this storm to come through because the belt just lifted where I'm here and I'm not up there right now. And people show up and they do that for an afternoon, and then all that food is saved so it can show up at the farmer's market. So there is no simple answer, but we're starting to come back to basics in this country in a really profound and beautiful way.
If I could throw something in here for a second. I'm thinking about this question of giving up. Juliet Schor in The Overworked American cites a study where if employees were given, in a couple of major corporations that she surveyed, if they were given the choice between having a raise at the end of the year or having that equivalent amount of salary in time off, they wouldn't want to give up any salary that they already had. But they were, in many cases, very willing to give up additional salary for time. And I wonder to what extent people's attachment to these objects, many of which are time-saving, and to which I am extremely attached, and as I am attached to an urban lifestyle, nevertheless, you wonder how much they're not compensations for the feeling that we do not have enough time. And that's this theme that I think that people have come back to again and again. And yes, it is true that we are almost going to be out of time for this too. But the way in which conflict is fueled by a feeling that there is no time to work out a solution, and the best we can get out of it may be a good cell phone.
And many of our, I'm sorry. Well, I was just going to drop in that, and many of our so-called time-saving devices somehow create more work for us, is the other point that many have made and have proven, that the more devices we add that are supposed to give us more time, the less time we actually have.
My good friend Paul Stuckey of Peter, Paul and Mary has a line in one of my favorite of his songs. He says, "I'm so busy saving time, I don't have any time to save."
That's great.
Just very, very briefly, both Chick and I work in mediation and peace processes very often. At least, I'd imagine it's true for both of us. We don't work with parties based upon telling them what they need to give up. We work with parties based upon seeing what are the core legitimate needs and interests that they have, and how do you actually achieve those more effectively through other means. I would see the solution to what you're saying, a vast, dramatic, and significant improvement in the quality of life and means of living for the overwhelming majority of people. I'm not talking about giving things up. I'm talking about replacing with better. A Chinese foreign minister recently said about the climate negotiations that the United States is pressing China and other countries to give up on some of their economic development. He pointed out that if U.S. citizens switched from the use of SUVs to normal cars like the rest of the world, the amount of pollution that would be reduced is the equivalent to what is being asked to be cut by all the rest of the industrializing countries together. Just by you beginning to use sane vehicles. The other side of it is, at the moment, we have economic systems based upon production for profit, not rationality, not quality of life, not efficient use of capabilities and innovation. Whereas capitalism at one point transcended and broke down inefficient means of production and productive relations, today it is both one of the most incompetent, inept, and inefficient economic systems that the world has ever known, but it is also the most brutally violent system we have in the world today. We've spoken a lot about direct violence wars. Direct violence are minuscule compared to the destruction of structural violence, the violence built into our social, economic, political systems, and cultural violence. Overwhelming majority of people, if we ask them, I think, and we do, lots of polling on this, they want quality of life. They want better life. They want more opportunities. The war being waged against workers in the United States and globally, the war being waged against the average citizen is a 30-year war in its intensity. It's much longer than that, but it's been intense for 30 years. It's not about telling people you're going to have to give up for everything to be better. It's about beginning to democratize our economic systems and making sure we're using the resources of our societies and of ourselves as communities and individuals to improve quality of life and not to rapaciously exploit and destroy over others.
General Hayashi, did you have?
No.
Okay.
Go on.
Next question, please.
Thank you. My name's Ken Johnson. I'm both a professor at another university and a student here. You've observed that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. You've also observed that, at least in some manner, the law of the power of the few, which in the business world is the 80-20 rule. How do we pragmatically leave this gathering and do concrete steps to make our political structures invert that and put the power back to the people instead of the few who have nothing in the game?
Keep pointing at him. Guy? Chick?
I lost my mic, so I have an excuse to not.
He asked for a pragmatic answer, so as a philosopher, I can't answer.
Philosophers
that obviously is a profound question that I don't think any of us would have a quick and easy answer to. But I would say that we see a movement going on in this country right now, which I find very disturbing, but it is a people's movement. There's a groundswell driven by, I think, a fear of things that are not understood and confusing, and they feel threaten their what they believe is the values of this country. But it's, at least I would expect most people in this room would agree that it's misguided. It's based on inaccurate information about the country's history and the culture and where we once were and where we are and where we should go. But there's some people getting that information out, and people are responding to it. And they're very effective at getting that information out and getting people to respond to it. And the people with a different worldview and a different set of values don't seem to be as effective at getting that kind of message out and motivating a response to it. And I think those of us that view peace and collaboration and cooperation with the rest of the world as a priority need to think through how we can better articulate the values that we hold dear and that frankly have been held dear by this country and most of the world throughout history. A lot of the stuff that these people are hearing is just not true. By the way, I get all this stuff. I am very close friends with Tea Party members. Very close friends with them.
That's who you were talking about?
I get their emails, the ones that circulate, and they are vicious and vile and totally, totally dishonest. And I'll push back. I'll send a message back. Say, I'm sorry, but you call yourself an evangelical Christian, and yet you put out information that you know is absolutely false. And here's the evidence that it's false. Now, they don't respond. They don't push back because they know that I know what I'm talking about. But so if they can be that successful with absolutely false information, why can't we be more successful and more strategic and effective in getting out true information? I think we need to be strategic about it, and they've made it a cause.
But we
need to make it a cause.
One of the challenges we know from dealing with conflicts, which was also said earlier, is the us-they. Because while we think certain information is true, others think other types of information is true. So one of the things I love most is the concept of dialogue. And dialogos, contrary to what a lot of Harvard publications say, does not mean through the word. It means through the Weltanschauung, the cosmology, the fundamental worldview. It means engaging with and understanding each other's worldview. Debate, on the other hand, for professors and peace workers who love to organize them, comes from desbattere, to beat, to attack, to kill, to destroy. So I sort of orient towards dialogues. I am fundamentally, at the quick and marrow of my bones, a pragmatist, because I can afford nothing less. I don't think it's pragmatic, those who argue that they're rationalists and yet pursue policies which, as we were saying, are irrational and dysfunctional. What can we do practically? One, identify what matters to you in life, what you value, what you believe in, what you care about. And realize that if you want to have it, it will come from your engagement, together with many others, but your engagement is key. Two, see what are your skills and capabilities. What are, as they would say in Hawaii, which was an independent nation before it was occupied and continues to be, what are your gifts? Find the ways that you can get involved. Three, don't think you always have to invent something new. Look at what is being done by others. Who's organizing in your community? In which ways? One of our major challenges is our ridiculous obsession with fragmentation and splintering. We have so many different things. Let's begin to weave and unite together. Four, identify common ground and respect diversity. I have tremendous respect for those who are saying we're all one. I'm actually deeply motivated and inspired by how extraordinarily schizophrenically diverse we are. And I love our diversity. That I celebrate. So you've got three philosophies. One, we're multitude. Two, we're one. Three, Ubuntu. I am who I am because of you. We are who we are because of each other. And in my classical peace-building approach, I'd say all three have value and relevance. I have studied and served revolutionary and liberation movements since I was 8 years old. That is what I do. We need to learn from how we have affected and organized change in the past and what we can do today. If I'm an artist, an architect, or an engineer, I systematically study and learn from what others are doing. If I'm a lawyer or a doctor, I systematically study, learn from what others are doing and developing. If you want to affect change in the world today, as some of us have been discussing, it is not enough to have good intentions. If all you have is good intentions, then pick up a gun and start shooting people. Because there is little line between. My mother has good intentions. I love my mother. If I have cancer, I don't want her to be my surgeon. She's trained as a teacher and a principal, not as a surgeon. This takes training and skill, because the structures in place are very complex. They're very well-rooted and well-funded and well-organized. So on the one hand, learn from, build, train, organize, act. Get out on the streets, talk with your neighbors, engage in dialogues. And if someone sends something you don't agree with and we send something back and then they don't respond, then go knock on their door, bring over tea and coffee, and engage with them. That's what we need, not to just allow. I have worked in war zones since I was 17 years old. This is one of the most divided, polarized, angry, sad, frustrating, hurting, and extraordinarily creative and fun countries I've ever been in my life. But it is a country that's ripped apart on so many levels, and you're making the rest of us suffer for it globally as well. So a lot of peace building domestically, but we need to act. We need to do. And if we don't know how, let's start discussing, training, preparing, and organizing. And as Gandhiji also said, there can be no movement without a newspaper. We need to find the ways of communicating and reaching out creatively. And at the end of the day, serve, struggle, celebrate, play, get involved, and make it happen.
You all know I've been playing the tough timekeeper, and I would be a
She's
hypocrite if I
delegated
didn't
it
do
to
it on
me.
my own panel, too. We are technically out of time.
I'm very sorry to those who had questions that are still outstanding, but please, there should be time to come up and actually have a conversation with the panelists. I want to thank everybody in the audience for having contributed so much thought to this conversation, and also to our panelists.